And now I'd like to invite to the podium the Chair of the Planning Committee, Jeff Bowser, who will introduce the program, and our keynote speaker. Jeff, as you know, is the President and CEO of Vanderbilt University Medical Center and Dean of the Vanderbilt School of Medicine. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, let me add my welcome to NAM's 52nd annual meeting in the 2022 scientific program. Echoing Victor, thank you to our annual planning committee and the NAM staff for their guidance and invaluable contributions to developing the scientific program, and for their incredible work to organize this meeting, the first hybrid in-person and virtual annual meeting. This weekend, and with this program, we're celebrating 50 years since the founding of the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, and as we celebrate, we're also cognizant that the challenges for health and medicine have never been greater. We have at our fingertips powerful genome editing capabilities with the potential for almost unimaginable health benefits, yet the potential for devastating outcomes. We're at the threshold of data science advances that will answer questions with breathtaking speed and scale, but also present unprecedented privacy risks. And we are, more than ever before, challenged by a divided public, some inspired by our advances, and others skeptical and even disdainful of biomedical science's finest accomplishments. So in planning this scientific program, the committee agreed that while it's certainly a time for celebration, it's also a pivotal time for reflection on the scientific enterprise itself. While science has changed remarkably over the past 50 years since our founding, the processes governing science have evolved far more slowly. In 1945, the nation's first presidential science advisor, Vannevar Bush, wrote the pivotal report, Science, the Endless Frontier. He articulated future directions for the federal support of science and innovation after World War II. Beyond the creation of the National Science Foundation, the Bush report shaped the future directions of scientific research that continue to frame our policies and practices more than half a century later, even as the technologies at the forefront of science have entirely reshaped the nature of discovery. Our paradigms governing training, publication, and funding largely look as they did 50 years ago, even though the challenges facing not only science, but the health and well-being of society have changed remarkably. So what better time than now to look ahead to the next 50 years and boldly consider whether our scientific enterprise is positioned for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And if we are going to re-engineer the biomedical research engine to best serve humanity, how would we actually do it? This broad challenge caused the Planning Committee to ask even more precise and perhaps uncomfortable questions. For example, what fundamental changes are needed in our models for the publication of science and for the funding of science? How do we conduct science in a manner that not only seeks but compels health equity and engages everyone to participate in the discovery process? Well, today's scientific program entitled Revolutionizing the Biomedical and Health Sciences will address those and many more questions, and is followed by a distinguished President's Forum led by President Zhao that will build on our discussions today. Our scientific program will feature 3 panels. The first will focus on factors limiting productivity and innovation, such as reproducibility, skewed incentives in publishing, and the lack of diversity in clinical cohorts, and will be moderated by Judy Woodruff of the PBS NewsHour. Our second panel will focus on transformative and innovative breakthroughs and paradigm shifts with the potential to redefine science and innovation, and will be moderated by Apoorva Mandavili of the New York Times. And in panel 3, we'll move to examples of breakthrough solutions, such as new funding and investing models, the promise of scientific convergence, and compelling ideas for building the next generation research workforce. This session will be moderated by Mariette DiCristina of Boston University. Now for some general logistical information. Following the panelists' remarks and moderated discussion, each panel will have about 15 minutes for audience question and answers. For those here in person, we'd ask you to please line up at the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. And if you're unable to access the microphone, please just raise your hand, and an NAM staff member will bring a microphone to you. We'll also be taking questions from the virtual audience, and we ask those listening via webcast to please utilize the Q&A tool under the live stream, which will be monitored by our NAM staff. In addition, after each panel, we will give the audience, all of us, an opportunity to answer a general question regarding the panel discussion using an audience response system called Slido. We look forward to seeing your reactions and perspectives. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, Dr. Mariana Mazzucato. She's professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London, where she's the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Her work challenges orthodox thinking about the role of the state and the private sector in driving innovation, how economic value is created, measured, and shared, and how market-shaping policy can be designed in a mission-oriented way to solve the grand challenges facing humanity. She's the winner of international prizes, including the 2020 John von Neumann Award and the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. She currently chairs the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mazzucato. Mariana, can you hear me? We have an audio problem. Just give us a moment. Thank you.
Mariana, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Dr. Mazzucato, we can hear you fine. We're in good shape.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen again, okay? Let's do that. Okay, so do you want to just let me know if you can still hear me and see the screen? Yes? No reply. I'll start talking. We're good?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Very good. Okay. So anyway, I was saying before when you couldn't hear me that I wish I was there with you all, because I do think that what you're speaking about today and what I'm going to try to address is kind of the question of our time, which is, are we learning the mistakes that we're making again and again? Do we really have to go from crisis to crisis to crisis and always be in reactive mode? What would it look like to have a proactive approach to how we organize business, to how we organize government, to how we also organize all sorts of other sectors, including in the third sector, we can call it philanthropy, civil society, these other areas of the economy, which we know in the health sector have been very important, to work together in a mission-oriented way. Why is it that it takes a war to teach us, again, what it means to have outcomes-oriented procurement, right? It took COVID to remind us that we had the Defense Production Procurement Act, which was developed after the Korean War, to actually structure, in that case, one particular instrument of government procurement, which is government purchasing, to be focused on an outcome, right? We're using it again now with baby formula. Globally, even in Italy, where I'm from, we used it to produce nationally personal protection equipment, which until COVID, we were 100% reliant on Chinese production. And in just 3 months, and believe me, nothing happens in 3 months in Italy, in 3 months, we were able to be 100% independent, producing all of personal protection equipment from 137 Italian small and medium enterprises. A tool like procurement, a tool like a grant, a tool like a public loan, a guarantee, a subsidy, a bailout program, a CHIPS Act. All of these tools can actually be designed in such a way that foster the public good, the common interest, or they can be a wasted opportunity. And this is really what I want to address, how we cannot continue to waste these opportunities, which unfortunately often come to us through crises. We're also facing today an energy crisis, if we don't learn how to actually govern the system differently. And what do I mean by the system? As an economist, I'm speaking about the economic system. And there is nothing inevitable in the economic system. Even the inflation that we're experiencing today, which I won't go into, that would be a whole other lecture, is not inevitable in terms of how we react to it. We need to understand the source of the inflation. If you just increase interest rates, you could actually make things worse, given that people already can't afford their energy bills. Now they also can't afford their mortgage bills. So how we react to a crisis, but also what causes the crisis, is not inevitable. And what I want to speak about in terms of health innovation and governing health innovation very much stems from that. How to begin with the understanding of the economy as an outcome of how we govern our public institutions, our private institutions, and how they interrelate one with the other. And I have the honor to be the chair of the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All, which really starts with that question. The question is, what if, a big what if we actually cared about the mission, the goal? And what if we framed it as health for all? So in the case of COVID, of course, it wasn't just the vaccines, not just one vaccine, 8 vaccines, but vaccinating the world, right? If you have a global pandemic, the mission surely is to vaccinate the world. What would it mean for how we design the economy, how we design intellectual property rights, how we design public-private partnerships, how we design procurement, how we design all the different types of interactions between public and private entities? And this very much comes from also some work that I've been thinking about for some years, and sorry for this self-promotional slide here, but very much about rethinking the narrative that we use to even describe government policy. The old narrative is that value is created in the private sector. And at best, what the public sector can do is to fix so-called market failures. In other words, when the market fails, whether it's because of positive externalities, like the need to invest in research and development, negative externalities, the need to have things like carbon taxes. If it's framed as correcting a market failure, you will always be kind of out of breath when you come to the problem. You will always be patching things up with different types of bandages. And what I think is really needed, and this is very much at the crux of what we're trying to do in the council, is a different framing, a different narrative, a different story, a different theory, but also different tools to co-create and co-shape the economy we want to live in, instead of constantly being stuck in this fixing, bandaging things up. And I'll be mainly focusing on some of the issues that I talk about in the latest book, Mission Economy, but it actually comes from some early thinking around the entrepreneurial state. If you think about public investments in areas like the National Institutes of Health in the US, which this year invested over $42 billion in taxpayer money in health innovation, what does it actually mean to take that into account in terms of the narrative of where value comes from in the first place? What does that mean for not just the story, but for then the tools that we use to share both the risks, because that's a massive risk sharing, but also the rewards? What does it mean to make sure the prices are right, the intellectual property rights are right to begin with, precisely so we don't have to ex post pick up the mess? And in this wonderful council, which again is called the Council on the Economics of Health for All at the World Health Organization, which was formed by Dr. Tedros, who asked me then to chair it 2 years ago. I should also say it's an all-woman council with 11 women from all over the world across the 5 continents. What we do is we, again, ask how to design an economy around a goal orientation, broadly defined as health for all, but of course, we unpack that in different elements of health for all. And the 4 broad areas of the work we've done have been around measurement. How do we account and value health for all? The way we actually design our GDP system actually is built to give us a problem when we confuse price with value. It's not a surprise that we haven't been resourcing our health systems enough. We've been clapping our essential workers. At least during COVID, we were clapping them. Did we learn to value that work, the social infrastructure of our global health systems? I fear not. How much of the global recovery, whether it's in the US, the close to 4 trillion of recovery funds, in Europe, our 2 trillion of recovery funds, and globally, how much of global recovery funds have strengthened our health system? I'm afraid the answer is a bit depressing. So second, capacity. It's impossible, to actually govern a system without a strong public administration. And when we outsource that administration, when we outsource the resource as well as not resource it enough, we have a problem. So how do we also have an all-of-government approach, for example, to the tools in that way that I discussed before with the outcomes-oriented procurement? What does that mean for the capacity, the capabilities that we need, and the fiscal space that we need? Third, finance. Finance isn't neutral. Money doesn't solve the problem. We need the money, and I just said we need more money, but even if we had all the money and all the finance in the world, if we don't structure the finance correctly, we have a problem. And I used to do a lot of work on financing of particular sectors, including the biotechnology sector, and I looked at how the financing model has often been the problem. Just think of venture capital. It's needed, of course. We need venture capital, but when that type of finance is exit-driven, when the exit has to happen in 3 or 5 years, exit through an IPO, initial public offering, or a buyout, we end up rushing the scientific process. And what's happened in the biotechnology sector, for example, is we've ended up with lots of PLIPOs, productless IPOs. It sounds like a disease. It is sort of a disease. And so, we need patient, long-term committed finance in the global south. Sometimes this comes from development banks. Sometimes it comes from multilateral banking. Of course, it comes from public innovation financing like the NIH and so on. But the conditionality embedded in that finance really matters. And we know that in the case of the World Bank and the IMF, it's often been problematic conditionalities that have actually ended up reducing the fiscal space that some countries in the developing world have then had in order to face their climate and health crises. Anyway, finance, the structure of finance matters more than ever. So the Financial Intermediary Fund today, which is supposed to help us prepare for the next pandemic, it can't just be about money housed within the World Bank. How we govern that finance matters immensely. And innovation, this is really my kind of passion. How do we govern an innovation system to really foster collective intelligence? And I love the word collective intelligence, and it's kind of become a word post-COVID, because we know what happens when we don't have collective intelligence. When the intellectual property rights system is abused, we don't get collective intelligence. And I have nothing against patents, by the way, but when patents are too broad, so too wide, used for strategic reasons, when they are too strong, hard to license, when they are too upstream in the innovation process, so the tools of research are being privatized, all these 3 examples make the patent system part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution. And that's a governance question. There's nothing inevitable in the patent system becoming a part of the problem. It's the decisions we've made that have, why is this not moving anymore? There we go. So maybe I'll just go quickly through some of these issues in terms of getting the value right, getting the governance right, the business right, the organizational structure right. First, I mentioned the word narrative before. I've always been struck how this sector, the health sector, is one of the most dysfunctional in terms of the story we tell of the collective intelligence. I already gave the example from the United States, but it's true also globally. I live in the UK. We have the Wellcome Trust. We have different types of public funds being very important for health innovation, but it's not part of the story. And even when Obama, did Obamacare, the idea that he was meddling in people's health care, it's not enough to say, no, we're not meddling. We're making sure that, 60 million people get the insurance they need. It's the meddling word that's the problem. That's what needs to be battled. Meddling in what? When 75% of new molecular entities with priority rating actually trace their funding back to different types of public funds, you're co-creating a system. You're not just trying to regulate it in the interest of people, which is also very important, but you've co-created the sector itself. And this really becomes important when we think about prices. You know, value-based pricing, I think, is a very distorted notion of value. One would have to ask value for whom. But the idea that actually the prices can basically go to what the market can bear through value-based pricing, and then you need the state to come in later to subsidize it, whether it's through Medicare and Medicaid in the US, whether it's through the National Health Service in the UK, so on and so forth. Why don't we just get the prices right from the beginning? And what should those prices be precisely, given how the goods themselves have come about? And, you know, the Bayh-Dole Act is fascinating because it actually has within it, this is the act that allowed publicly funded research to be patented since 1980. It has, as part of the act, that the government should have the right to have march-in rights for publicly funded drugs. They've never actually used that right. So I think it's also a confidence problem. Even when it's in the law and we don't use it, there's something about the narrative and the energy in the room that makes you almost fearful. You can put in all that money, $42 billion a year of NIH money, but then you fear, you know, affecting the price and the system because, of course, that's for the market and maybe the welfare state later to come in to subsidize. Now, I could say more, but I think, you know, others have also been talking about this. I've been talking to some US lawmakers about it over the last 10 years. And I think this problem is out there, but this is one of the key questions, I think, in terms of getting the economy right ex ante, so we don't have to pick up and bandage up the mess afterwards. And getting the governance right itself is interesting because it's not enough to, you know, put in all this money into the system. What would it mean actually to have conditionality? Right? So imagine if the National Institute of Health program itself had stronger conditions attached in terms of sharing the knowledge. You know, just look at what happened with the 8 different vaccines we have out there. I think they're a great test case of how we can actually do these things differently. The AstraZeneca vaccine, which was basically negotiated over with the Oxford University researchers, determined a certain type of vaccine, which was lower cost, lower price, stronger knowledge sharing around it. Very different from the Pfizer vaccine, very much as a result of, you know, these two companies being willing or not to negotiate around, I would call it, common good principles. And, you know, this issue of business, I think, is really important because the word business doesn't mean anything. The word government doesn't mean anything. I mean, it means something, but what really matters are the details. How do we govern a system with the granular decisions that businesses have to make every day, the granular decisions that, that governments have to make every day in such a way to be outcomes oriented? And this means that these governance decisions need to be looked at. So the corporate governance within business, this actually is very different between companies. You have some companies that have become over time ultra financialized. What do I mean by that? A very high percentage of the net income they're earning ends up getting just distributed to shareholders, whether it's through dividend payouts, but also through different types of practices like share buybacks. There's nothing wrong with just buying back your shares sometimes. There's good reasons to do that. But the excessive use of share buybacks in a kind of Anglo-Saxon form of capitalism has become something that, you know, the business world itself is talking about in terms of changing that away from shareholder value maximization towards stakeholder value maximization. What does it mean to put purpose at the center of that? Well, something like 5 trillion, that's 12 zeros, dollars have been used by the global 500 companies to buy back their shares in the last 10 years. And historically, the pharmaceutical companies, alongside the large energy companies like Exxon, have actually been at the top of that list. So Pfizer and Exxon are actually very high at the top of that list. So all of these are issues that, first of all, the world is talking about, the business world is talking about, but it itself could become part of what I would call conditionality, a new social contract between government and business, precisely in a sector that receives this huge amount of public subsidy. So conditionality may be making sure that these funds are actually reinvested back into the system. And, you know, in terms of getting the organizational competence and structure right, what I always find fascinating, and the reason I wrote Mission Economy, is we would have never gone to the moon, ever, had we just thought of it as a money problem. You know, just put in a bunch of money here from the public sector and a bit from the private sector, and we're somehow going to get to the moon. It required an organizational form. It required an organization like NASA, which, there's other organizations similar to NASA in terms of the dynamism and the project management of the organizations like DARPA, of course, which has been studied by lots of people, including myself. We do that when it's about the military. DARPA and NASA have been very interesting organizational forms of public investment because they were linked to a military-industrial complex. They, by the way, do get the prices right, including when BARDA, the B-A-R-D-A, BARDA funds health innovation. Because it's been linked to the military complex, they weren't naive about it in terms of making sure that the solutions and the remedies actually reached the people that they were intended for. DARPA itself has funded a lot of health innovation, and they made sure that the prices and intellectual property rights, the procurement was done in such a way that, for example, the soldiers on the battlefield who get sick receive the remedies that were co-invested in by the DARPA funding. And yet we haven't done that with health. And this is why already back in 2017, I actually wrote a report called The People's Prescription with some colleagues where we called for an ARPA-H. This was pre-COVID. And it's nice to see also that this is being kind of highlighted again as an important development. And the idea really is that it's not enough just to throw money at problems. We also need to think of the organizational form that can then collaborate dynamically with the private sector, but also have a flat, nimble, non-bureaucratic structure, have an outcomes orientation, have attention to that public-private partnership that really kind of, takes on the point that this is about risk sharing. DARPA doesn't pretend it's just fixing markets. It has always seen itself as an investor of first resort, and hence has also put a lot of attention to the design of the collaboration with the private sector. In my book, Mission Economy, I looked at how NASA even had a no excess profits clause in the Apollo program in terms of how it worked with the private sector. They also, the first thing they did in NASA was to change procurement to be fixed price, like a challenge-oriented procurement with incentives for innovation and quality improvement, away from a more kind of cost-plus, boring form of procurement, which doesn't inspire innovation. But also, these kind of mission-oriented organizations, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is what does it mean for other bits of our public landscape to think about mission-oriented policy. So mission-oriented organizations of the HARPA kind, but also mission-oriented policy. Going to the moon and back in a short amount of time, that was a mission. The grand challenge was beat the Russians. Today, that means something else, but already back then, beat the Russians. And then what they did was not just aerospace. They brought lots of different sectors together. Nutrition, materials, electronics, software. So many different homework problems had to be solved, which got us the spillovers we have today, camera phones, again, software, foil blankets, baby formula. Lots of those innovations came about bottom up in the business sector as solutions for a very strong publicly directed target and mission. And unfortunately, we don't have this often. What we end up with is ideas that the importance is to commercialize a sector, including space today, bringing in the private sector, which of course is important. But when we then lack a clear mission statement, that relationship between public and private can go really wrong. And of course, the mission itself can't be commercialization. That should be one of the outcomes. And the irony is that when commercialization is the mission, we don't even commercialize very well because there's no common goal that actually stimulates a lot of that innovation. I worked with different governments, including the UK government when it was still functional, around thinking about mission-oriented industrial strategy. This is just an example of how we worked. In other words, instead of just having a list of sectors like life sciences to throw a lot of money at, what would it look like if we had really clear kind of mission statements like zeroing the digital divide, having carbon neutral cities across the United Kingdom, but also enhancing the capabilities and quality of life across the course of our increasingly longer lives to formulate an interesting mission statement around aging and what that would mean for an industrial strategy. So cross-sectoral investment, cross-sectoral risk sharing, but also a more symbiotic public-private relationship around those. And again, in the work of the council, I won't go through all the great work we've done, but I do recommend you go to our website to look at some of the work that we've done around those 4 themes of value, innovation, finance, and capacity, very much trying to bring this kind of, mission-oriented thinking to the table. And, it's more important than ever because actually there's COVID relief funds, recovery funds, there's global funds, like, as I mentioned, the Financial Intermediary Fund. And unless we actually govern these funds in a mission-oriented way, we end up with quite a few problems along the way that we create. And let me just move here. So I just mentioned the Financial Intermediary Fund. Yeah. I think it's really important to also maybe sandbox, let's try to do this differently. I already mentioned the vaccine. I think there's a real opportunity, and I'm not sure anyone's done it, to unpick what actually happened with vaccine development and where it went wrong in terms of that public-private relationship. How can we really build, again, this kind of more symbiotic ecosystem from the start so we don't have to pick up the mess later? And there's an opportunity to do that now with the mRNA technology hubs. There's 15 countries around the world that are contributing to the kind of hub and spoke mRNA governance system. And we're starting through the council to actually work closely with the hub precisely to pay a lot of attention to the conditionality, to design of the collaboration, to the design of the knowledge sharing, the patent pooling, the pricing system, but especially the collaboration, because all of this has to be about collaboration. It's not about one party, the government doing everything. That's where, of course, it differs also from the Apollo program, where the mission itself actually did come quite a bit top down, even though the solutions came bottom up. Increasingly, these social challenges that we have, which are harder than going to the moon, so the health challenges, the climate challenges, there's one issue, which is who actually decides what the mission itself is? How can we truly also co-create it by listening, having more empathy, and truly fostering that collective intelligence also in terms of the mission statements themselves? And one of the things I've tried to do through the institute that I set up at University College London, I can just actually stop sharing in a minute here, is, like really asking what is the new design of the state itself that all of this requires? And Plato had this wonderful quote, which apparently was actually a quote from a famous Native American Indian, but we can attribute it both to Native Americans and to Plato, which is that storytellers rule the world. And there's something about the stories we're currently telling about health innovation, which I truly think are hurting our ability to galvanize that collective intelligence. And to change the story, we need to talk less about fixing markets, more around co-creating, less about de-risking, more about welcoming the uncertainty, which means you might screw up along the way. Kennedy's famous quote, "We're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy," is completely different from the policy wonk terminology we have today, which is all about facilitating and de-risking. And I'm Italian, and facile means easy. So facilitating means you're making something easier for someone else. It's very different from saying we're doing it because it's hard. So welcoming uncertainty, experimentation, trial and error means also for the civil service itself, public administrations being willing to accept that failure, but also making sure we're sharing not just in the risks, but also the rewards. Away from picking winners. So, the point of government is not to choose one technology, one firm, one sector, but really, truly picking the willing and tilting the playing field, not leveling it in the direction. So rewarding those organizations that are willing to move with you, for example, around an innovation system that is fostering collective intelligence. Why should subsidies, guarantees, or grants be given to or being benefited by companies that refuse to at least reinvest those profits that are collectively created into the system, as opposed to share buybacks? The outsourcing issue is massive. There was the head of procurement in the NASA program in Apollo, this guy, Ernest Brackett. He already started witnessing back in the 1960s something that a new book I'm writing called The Big Con, the history of how consulting has weakened our business, infantilized our government, and warped our economy. He was already warning against that back then. He said, if we continue to outsource our brain in government, we won't even know who to work with. We will get captured, he said, by brochuremanship. So this is a huge issue. How do we insource that government capacity? Because we know businesses require capacity. Of course, they create value. Well, of course, governments too. And if we haven't been investing within, not just through government, but within government, we will have a problem. And also there's a whole issue of metrics. You know, how do we actually evaluate a system which is trying to create a market and not just fix one? How do we evaluate a system where the success should be how much economy-wide spillovers we've been able to foster across all those different sectors, just like going to the moon, as I mentioned, was not just aerospace. Well, surely all our health challenges have as much to do with the preventative areas, including nutrition, but also how we build our mobility systems, how we walk, where we walk, how our cities are constructed. There's all sorts of different, really important challenges there. Let me just turn this off to say goodbye to you with my face on screen. So just to say, it's such an honor to be able to address you today. My time is up. And if there's one word or one last thing I'd like to say to you is that I often walk in as an economist to meetings with government officials, and I come out as a life coach because I do believe we have a bit of depression. There is just think of what's happening today with the kind of, Elon Musk narrative of space without any real recognition on how he stood on the shoulders of a giant. Again, the NASA program, but this is even more true in the health sector. Lots of different actors, biotech companies, large pharmaceutical companies, different types of public entities globally. We need to rethink the narrative and the story of how to talk about the wealth that's created collectively, but also the tools to make them more outcomes oriented and to truly make sure that the benefits of this incredible wealth creating machine are truly reaching the most people possible. And surely for the next pandemic, let's make sure we're more prepared because we were really caught off guard. Thank you very much. I can no longer hear you.
Dr. Mazzucato, thank you first of all, for your patience with our technical challenges at the beginning, and most importantly, for your important remarks on reshaping the governance of health by changing the narrative. Thank you so much. And once again, please, let's express our thanks for Dr. Mazzucato.